We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
In most investigations, law enforcement spreads outward. They expand the search area, they widen the suspect pool, they follow leads in every direction. But in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, something different has happened. Investigators keep coming back to the same street. That detail matters more than it first appears. Nancy, 84 years old, vanished from her Catalina Foothills home on February 1st. She was last known to be inside the house shortly after 9:50 p.m. on January 31st. At 1:47 a.m., her doorbell camera was disabled. At 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker monitoring system lost wireless contact. Her back doors were later found propped open. Blood was recovered from the porch and matched to Nancy. The abduction was officially classified as targeted. Those are confirmed facts. But what has quietly shaped the investigation since those early hours is not just what happened inside her home. It is what may have happened next door. Within days of Nancy's disappearance, neighbors began raising questions about a nearby rental property. It sat close enough to her home that a person standing at one window could likely see the approach to her front door. In a neighborhood where people know one another's routines, that house stood out. Some residents believed the renters had moved out shortly before Nancy disappeared. Others believed they left immediately afterward. There's been conflicting reporting on that detail. But what is not disputed is this. Federal agents returned to that street weeks later asking targeted, name-by-name questions about that specific property. That is not routine. When the FBI conducts a standard neighborhood canvass, agents ask general questions. Have you seen anything unusual? Did you notice unfamiliar vehicles? Did you hear anything overnight? Returning later with specific names suggests something more focused. It suggests the street itself remains central to the theory. And that brings us to a quiet but important investigative principle: proximity. Crimes of opportunity can happen randomly. Crimes of planning often happen close. Close to what the suspect knows. Close to where they feel comfortable. Close to where their presence does not stand out. A retired SWAT commander from the same county described publicly how a nearby rental property could function as a staging location, not as a hiding place after the crime, but as a base before it. That distinction matters. A staging location allows someone to observe without appearing to observe, to sit in a driveway without being suspicious, to walk the street without being questioned, to watch patterns without drawing attention. If someone lived in that nearby rental, even temporarily, they would not need binoculars or dramatic equipment to gather information. They would simply live. They would notice what time Nancy's lights went out. They would see when her garage door closed. They would learn whether overnight visitors were common or rare. Observation, when done slowly and patiently, rarely looks like surveillance. It looks like routine. Now consider two dates that Nancy's family later asked the public to remember: January 11th and January 24th. On January 11th, a masked individual appeared at Nancy's door and was captured on camera. No forced entry occurred that night. No abduction attempt was made. Some former federal agents have described that appearance as possibly a rehearsal. Not a mistake, not a failed attempt, a test. If that interpretation is accurate, then February 1st was not the beginning of something sudden. It was the final stage of something practiced. January 24th, 1 week before the abduction, is the second date investigators have asked people to think about carefully. 2 separate evenings, 3 weeks apart, both inside the same neighborhood. When investigations begin to cluster around repeated activity in one area, professionals pay attention to pattern. Pattern is stronger than noise. This case has generated more than 13,000 tips. Many of those tips likely led nowhere. That is common in high-profile investigations. There was a SWAT operation roughly 2 miles away. It produced no arrest. A delivery driver was detained and released after mistaken identification. A vehicle was towed and examined without public resolution. Each visible lead expanded outward, and each time, the investigation returned to the original block. That is not investigative drift. It is narrowing. It suggests that despite the noise, despite public speculation, despite tips from across the state, the core of the evidence still points back to proximity. There is another parallel thread investigators have reportedly pursued. Construction workers active in the neighborhood during the weeks before February 1st. Federal agents asked homeowners for the names of every worker on nearby job sites. Not company names, individual names. Why would that matter? Because construction work provides legitimate access. Workers move through properties daily. They park vehicles on streets without suspicion. They observe rhythms without appearing to do so. In quiet, established neighborhoods, unfamiliar faces stand out. But familiar work trucks blend in. The question investigators appear to be asking is not dramatic. It is simple. Who had a reason to be there? Not once. Repeatedly. Over weeks. That is how proximity crimes unfold. They rely on familiarity. They rely on blending. They rely on being close enough to watch without being noticed. Now, let us turn to something even more important. DNA. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed publicly that mixed DNA was recovered from inside Nancy's home. Not matching Nancy, not matching her immediate family. Laboratories are currently working to separate those mixed profiles. Genetic genealogy has been engaged. That process can take time, months, sometimes longer. But if an unknown profile from Nancy's home were ever matched to biological material from another location, such as a nearby rental property, the case would shift dramatically. 2 locations, 1 profile? There is no neutral explanation for that. Investigators know this, which may explain why silence surrounds the vacant property. When agencies decline to comment on specific locations during active investigations, it does not mean nothing happened there. It often means something is still being evaluated. For viewers who have followed investigations over many years, you understand something important. Cases do not always break through spectacle. They often break through convergence. A name from a construction roster aligns with a lease record. A lease record aligns with a DNA profile. A DNA profile aligns with genealogical mapping. And suddenly, the same street that seemed ordinary becomes central. Nancy left her home in her pajamas. Without her medication, without her shoes, her back doors were propped open, her camera was disabled. Those details suggest planning. Planning requires preparation. Preparation requires time spent nearby. And time spent nearby leaves traces. When something terrible happens in a quiet neighborhood, the first instinct is to imagine an outsider. A stranger passing through. A random intruder. Someone who did not belong there. But investigators are trained to ask a different question. Who did belong there? Because in many planned abductions, the greatest advantage is not force. It is familiarity. Let's slow this down. The Catalina Foothills is not a transient neighborhood. It is established. Long-term residents, predictable routines, streets where unfamiliar cars are noticed and unfamiliar faces remembered. One longtime neighbor said she immediately recognized when someone looked out of place. That is not unusual in communities like this. People know the normal pattern. That means anyone planning something would need a way to appear normal. Art and normal comes from repetition. If someone rented a nearby property weeks before February 1st, their presence would not trigger suspicion. The mailbox would have their name. Their car would be seen regularly. Their lights would turn on and off like everyone else's. They would belong. If someone worked on a construction project in the area, their truck would blend into the daytime landscape. They would walk between homes. They would carry equipment. They would have a reason to pause at a curb or study a roofline. They would belong. Familiarity lowers defenses, both for the suspect and for the community. Now consider what familiarity produces over time. It produces knowledge, not dramatic knowledge, not secret files, simple observational knowledge. What time Nancy's garage door closed? Whether she typically went out late at night, whether visitors stayed overnight, whether lights in certain rooms turned off at consistent times, how long her porch light remained on. If you live next door or work nearby for several weeks, you do not need sophisticated surveillance to learn these things. You see them. And if you intend harm, that information becomes strategy. This is where the January dates matter again. January 11th, the masked individual at the door. January 24th, another evening investigators have asked the public to account for. Those are not random references. If someone appeared at Nancy's door weeks before the abduction, it suggests testing. Testing response time. Testing whether anyone nearby reacted. Testing how long it took for a porch light to switch on. Testing whether the doorbell camera angle captured their face clearly. That kind of testing requires comfort. A stranger driving in from miles away to test a single door risks exposure. Someone already living or working nearby risks very little. They simply walk home afterward. That is why proximity keeps resurfacing in this case. Let's also consider the physical layout. If the nearby rental property truly sat within clear view of Nancy's home, then repeated observation could have occurred without ever approaching her door. A chair positioned near a window. A parked car angled just slightly. A person stepping outside at night under the pretense of taking out trash or making a phone call. None of those actions appear suspicious on their own, but over time, they build awareness. And awareness reduces uncertainty. Indeed, one of the most unsettling aspects of this case is how quickly the abduction appears to have unfolded. Camera disabled at 1:47 a.m., back doors propped open. No loud struggle heard by neighbors. Nancy taken without shoes or medication. That sequence suggests confidence. Confidence usually comes from preparation. Preparation usually comes from proximity. Now let's examine another detail carefully. The FBI reportedly went door to door requesting the names of every construction worker active in the area during the weeks before Nancy disappeared. That is granular work. It suggests investigators are not simply looking for a stranger passing through. They are accounting for people who had routine access. Each worker's presence can be logged against job schedules. Each rental occupant's lease can be reviewed. Each timeline can be compared to Nancy's. Investigators often ask themselves, who had opportunity without attracting attention? Because opportunity in quiet neighborhoods depends on blending in. If someone unfamiliar stood on Nancy's street at midnight repeatedly, someone would notice. If someone who lived there did the same, few would question it. There is also something else about familiarity that matters. It creates psychological comfort for the offender. Being close to the target repeatedly can reduce hesitation. It can normalize the act. It can make February 1st feel less like a leap and more like a final step in a process already rehearsed. That psychological shift is subtle but powerful. Now, let's return to the DNA evidence. Mixed DNA recovered from Nancy's home remains under laboratory analysis. Separating mixed profiles is complex work. It requires deconvolution techniques and sometimes advanced genealogical databases. If that unknown profile is eventually identified, investigators will ask one key question. Did this person have a legitimate reason to be inside Nancy's home? If the answer is no, then proximity becomes critical. Did that same individual have a legitimate reason to be in the neighborhood in the weeks before February 1st? If the answer is yes, through rental occupancy or construction work, then familiarity and opportunity intersect. Two independent facts become one narrative, and narratives built on intersection are strong. It is also important to remember that familiarity does not always mean personal relationship. There is no public evidence suggesting Nancy knew her abductor. Familiarity can be entirely one-sided. Someone can study another person's routine without ever speaking to them. Someone can live nearby without ever introducing themselves. That asymmetry is what makes proximity crimes so unsettling. The victim remains unaware. The offender feels informed. For many viewers, especially those who have lived in stable neighborhoods for decades, this idea can feel deeply personal. We trust repetition. We trust routine. We trust the sense that if we see the same car every day, it belongs. But repetition can also conceal. And that may be why investigators continue circling back to the same street. They are not expanding outward because the evidence may not point outward. They are narrowing inward because proximity may hold the key. In investigations like this, there is a moment that often arrives quietly, not with flashing lights, not with a dramatic announcement, but with alignment. Alignment between proximity, evidence, and time. Up to this point, we have walked carefully through what appears to be the central question in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Who had the advantage of being close? Close enough to observe, close enough to rehearse, close enough to act without standing out. Now we must examine what happens if that proximity intersects with forensic confirmation. Because proximity alone creates suspicion, evidence transforms suspicion into accountability. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed that mixed DNA was recovered from inside Nancy's home. That means more than one genetic profile was present, while laboratories are currently working to separate those mixed samples. This process is detailed and technical. It involves isolating genetic markers from overlapping contributors and building clean profiles from complex data. It takes time. But once separated, each unknown profile becomes a question. Who does this belong to? If genetic genealogy is successful and it has solved cases decades old, investigators may not need a direct database match. They can identify distant relatives, build family trees, and narrow candidates systematically. When that happens, the first investigative step is not arrest. It is comparison. Does the person identified have a reason to have been inside Nancy's home? If the answer is no, then investigators look at opportunity. Were they in the neighborhood? Did they work nearby? Did they rent nearby? Did their timeline intersect with January 11th? With January 24th? With February 1st? This is where proximity returns. Imagine a scenario where an unknown DNA profile from Nancy's home is eventually traced to an individual who rented a property on the same street weeks before the abduction. That is not proof on its own, but it demands explanation. Now imagine that same profile aligns with a construction worker whose presence in the neighborhood is documented repeatedly in the weeks before February 1st. Again, not automatic proof. But now familiarity, access, and biological trace exist together. When two independent investigative paths intersect, cases move quickly. Cross-location DNA is particularly powerful in court. If biological material from Nancy's home were ever matched to biological material recovered from a nearby rental property, if such processing occurred, prosecutors would call that cross-scene confirmation. Two scenes, one profile, one person to explain both. There are very few innocent explanations for that. But let us remain measured. As of today, there is no publicly named suspect, no arrest, no official confirmation linking the rental property or construction worker thread to the DNA. What exists publicly is structure. Structure in the investigative approach. The FBI returning to the same street. The focus on legitimate access. The classification of the abduction as targeted. The repeated emphasis on January 11th and January 24th. These are not scattered details. They form a sequence. Now consider something else quietly important. Every visible outward lead, the SWAT operation 2 miles away, the detained delivery driver, the towed vehicle, expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood. Each of those avenues appears publicly to have resolved without arrest. And after each one, the investigation returned inward. Back to the street. Back to proximity. That pattern suggests confidence in a core theory. Not stagnation, but narrowing. There is also the matter of silence. When federal agencies decline to comment on a specific property or line of inquiry during an active investigation, it is rarely accidental. It protects integrity. It prevents contamination. It shields potential evidence from public interference. Silence in this context can signal that something remains under active evaluation. Now, for viewers who have followed cases across decades, you know this rhythm: months of apparent stillness. Then one day, alignment. A profile resolves, a warrant is executed, an arrest is made, and suddenly, what seemed like isolated pieces form a clear image. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She was taken without her medication, without her shoes, from a home in a neighborhood where strangers are noticed. Her camera was disabled at 1:47 a.m. Her pacemaker monitoring system disconnected at 2:28 a.m. Her back doors were propped open. Blood was found on the porch. Those facts are steady. They do not change. What changes is interpretation, as new information is layered on top. If proximity was the advantage, then the person responsible did not arrive randomly. They prepared, they rehearsed, they watched. Like, that preparation suggests forethought. Forethought leaves logistical traces, leases, work logs, digital footprints, biological material. All of those are trackable. And when trackable elements intersect, they create momentum. It is also worth addressing something emotional but grounded. For many in the 65-plus audience, the idea that someone could quietly study a neighbor for weeks is unsettling. It challenges our sense of familiarity as safety. But it also offers something else. It suggests the person responsible did not vanish into the unknown. They were somewhere specific, doing something specific. On a street, investigators continue to examine carefully. There is a difference between a case that expands endlessly outward and one that circles back repeatedly to the same physical location. The second often resolves. Because repetition signals pattern, and pattern signals structure. Nancy's family has offered a combined reward of $1.1 million alongside federal contributions. More than 13,000 tips have been submitted. Some of those tips may be small: a vehicle seen twice, a worker who stopped appearing suddenly, a rental that changed hands quietly. Sometimes resolution comes from science, sometimes it comes from memory, and sometimes it comes from the intersection of both. Proximity may have given someone the advantage once, but proximity also narrows the field. And when evidence, timing, and familiarity finally meet, cases like this do not remain open forever. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, but investigations built on pattern rarely end in uncertainty. They end in convergence, and convergence is often closer than it appears.